with your characters. Same things with factions and governments and politics. You want to think politically. Why do particular factions not like other factions? Does it have to do with economics? We can think about economics. What's the economics on a global level? Like the United States economics in the world. What's the economics on a state level? What's Virginia's economic situation? And then your town. So Virginia has an economic situation. The United States has an economic situation. But if you pick any town in Virginia, it's different. What are the businesses? How are people doing? There are affluent towns. There are populous towns. There are also poor towns, and towns that are in debt. And the living conditions of the people in all of these places is very, very different. So you can think about that. Economics is important. Religion is important. What are your major religions? What do people believe in? How does the afterlife work? Is there a mythology? So you can look at that, and you can look at that on those three levels with the three facets of the microscope. That's cool too. History is really important. The fantasies and the sci-fis that are lasting and lingering, the worlds have a history behind them. And this is the difficult part. If you write in the real world, history's always been written or already been written. You know what you're using. But if you're creating a fantasy world, not only are you creating literally everything from the ground up, the geography, the religion, the characters, but you have to give that world a history, of a believable history, and make it feel like it's existed prior to your creation of it. So again, history is on three levels. You've got like the big global history, world history, if you will. Then you've got sort of the history of the area, the state in which your characters exist. That's like U.S. VA history. And then you've got the history of the town, of the characters themselves, the history on the local level that we're really going to get into. What history do your characters have with each other? What kind of family stories do they have? Like all of those sorts of things. So hopefully you're really getting the sense of scale and scope. And remember, it's that smallest level that's the most important, that's going to allow your readers to suspend disbelief and to invest in your characters and to care about them as people. And that's the level that we forget about as world builders the most. We spend almost all of our time on like these big ideas because they're sort of exciting. And we miss the small ones that bring life to the scene. So the other things that I guess you want to think about, when you think about a magic system, is your world have magic in it? If you do have magic in it, it needs to be consistent. You need to have rules in order for it to be believable. If people just do whatever they want whenever they want to, you're going to lose your readers. So, just like physics has rules in the real world, magic's got to have rules in your world building. So there's lots of stuff like that. And I could go on and on, but I really wanted to try and keep this video to under 20 minutes, and I'm at 17 right now. So I'm just going to talk a little tiny bit more, to give you your assignment on maps, and then we'll call it a day. So the last thing I want to talk about, I have talked about scope a lot. I've talked about those three levels, and that's really important. But think about some of the stories that are failures. I think a good one to think about, especially in creative writing, like Star Wars. We have a number of Star Wars movies out there, and some of them are very successful, and some of them are not successful. I would say that the original three Star Wars movie, New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, are successful movies because their scope is small enough that it makes sense, especially the first one, A New Hope. When you watch that movie, the whole thing takes place in 3 scenes. It's over a short period of time. There's not a lot of travel. There's not a lot of global stuff. You have like the scene on Tatooine. You have the prologue, which occurs above Tatooine. Then you have the scene on Tatooine with Luke. Then you have the scene with the Death Star, and then you have the scene with destroying the Death Star. And so it takes place in a limited scope of locations. It takes place in a limited scope of time. The whole thing is not some extended, enormous amount of time. And the characters develop in that shortened sense of time. If you go to the prequels, if you go to the only good prequel is Revenge of the Sith. But if you go to the prequels, the real problem with the prequels is that They try and do too much. They have this huge scope. You're galaxy hopping everywhere, and huge amounts of time are theoretically passing. You watch Anakin from being a kid to turning into Darth Vader, and it's not really believable. The scope is too big. He's on that high level almost the entire time, and so you don't end up having the investment that you have in the characters. And so when I wrote my novel, it's called 3 Days and 2 Nights, I intentionally limited the scope. The whole story takes place over the course of 3 days and 2 nights. The map that I have in the story, because I think maps are important to fantasy stories, but the map that I have in the story is a local level map. Like when you look at it, the key, is an inch is like a league. And so a league is 3 miles. So the whole map is, 50 miles square or something like that. So everything is down to this narrow scope. And I feel like that's what makes the novel meaningful and relatable, and it doesn't get lost in its own glorification of the larger world. So you want to think about scope not only in terms of distance and the size of your world, but you also want to think about it in terms of time. How long is your story take place? Over what period of time? You want to narrow that as much as you can. The smaller the amount of time, the easier the story is to write. The bigger the amount of time, the more unwieldy it gets, the more difficult and cumbersome it is to structure. You also want to think about scope in terms of characters. In this story, I have like 10 characters. It's relatively easy for me to keep track of them all and to develop them all. But if you're George R.R. Martin, there are so many characters as a reader you don't even know who they are. I actually have to make a list of the characters and write them down and keep it in the book on my bookmark in order to know what's going on in Game of Thrones. That's too much for me. As an author, how would I do that? I'd have to have a spreadsheet with all of the characters and their interconnections just to keep up with it all. I don't personally want to write that. Now, would I like to have written Game of Thrones and made all that money? Sure, absolutely, but I don't think I have the capacity to keep up with that as an author. So scope for me needs to be limited in order to be successful as a writer. And maybe once I've written a lot more, maybe once I've gotten more comfortable with it, I'd be able to do that. But certainly we don't have the time. I don't have the time to grade a Game of Thrones if you were to write it. But these are all things you want to keep in mind as you plan and as you world build. So your assignment for today is relatively simple. I want you to pick a genre. I want you to pick a tone, and then get map making. Think about what your maps are going to look like. Try and draw your 3 maps, your global level map, your state level map, and your local level map. And that will help you as you create. Last thing I'm going to say, the truth is that I learned a lot of this stuff in sort of a roundabout way. I didn't learn about this stuff necessarily by writing and getting a lot of experience that way. I learned about world building through Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I played a lot of D&D when I was in high school and into college, and I was always a dungeon master just because I was creative that way, and I could think on the fly, and I could make up characters. And so a lot of what I learned about world building, I learned through successes and failures in creating these stories in the Dungeons and Dragons realm. And having those 3 maps was a lifesaver to me, and I found it to be a lifesaver to me in writing as well. So trust me on this. Work your 3 microscope levels, see what you come up with, and go have some fun. Yeah. So I look forward to seeing your maps and seeing your genres and getting you started on this project. Anybody who has questions, shoot me an email because all of these videos need to be set up in a way that fits school rules. I have to disable comments on the videos. You can give me a like if you want, but that's about all you can do. So if you have questions, shoot me a message, send me an email, and I will get back to you. I hope you're all doing well, and I will talk to you with a future lecture, I guess next week, maybe. See ya.